Welcome back to EW, a series where I'm going to be breaking down everything wrong with specific Magic the Gathering cards. This will be more so in relation to Standard. Today, you all voted on Sunfall over Farewell, so that's what you're going to get. And it was the card that I was originally planning to make a video on anyway, so that works out. Now, if you don't know what Sunfall does, although I'm sure you all do, it's a 5-mana sweeper, exiles all creatures, and Incubate X, where X is the number of creatures exiled this way. And Incubate X, basically you get an incubator token with X +1/+1 counters on it, and you can pay 2 to transform that into a Phyrexian artifact creature. Essentially, the amount of stats you're getting on the Phyrexian creature that you're going to get is going to be equal to the amount of creatures you exiled. And a perfect example of a deck that abuses Sunfall is Atraxa Ramp, a deck that is looking to buy itself time, a deck that is looking to play and cast big spells. And what better way to tie everything together than with the best sweeper in the format? All right, let's start things off from a game design perspective. In general, when you're designing a sweeper in white, usually it's going to be a destruction-based sweeper if we're talking about destroy all creatures. Usually no upside. If upside costed much higher, essentially the premium has to be tied to a cost, and that cost has to be quite large because sweepers in general in games, you don't want it to be a swing on top of a swing. A sweeper should already be a board reset for the control player or the player playing the sweeper. It resets the game, but it should not give the player casting the sweeper more of an advantage already, because sweepers puts the players that are, trying to go wide or whatever, or just be on board in general, it puts them very far behind because they have to rebuild. And that is really dangerous if the control player gains an advantage on top of that. It can really swing the game. So yeah, when you're pricing sweepers, you have to be careful about really making sure that every bonus they have is tied to a price. And really good sweepers that are going to be on the cheaper side, but not quite like super cheap. I'm mostly talking about a card that's really well designed, like Depopulate. Usually those cards have a specific downside. Now, it doesn't have to be a downside every time, but a very intelligent downside that makes the card useful in matchups where it needs to be good, like for example against mono red or against like basically single color aggro decks or stuff like that. You want Depop to be at its best, so you just give it no downside there. But when you start playing against like multicolor decks that usually are a little bit slower, usually I'm talking about usually, you give your opponent back a little bit of their potential advantage, right? So you give them a chance to come back in the game more so. And I think that's really good card design for a sweeper, where it's good in the matchups where it's supposed to be good in, and in the matchups where it's like a little bit less good but still good, it does make the games go a little bit more back and forth by giving your opponent a little bit more of an advantage, in some way, shape, or form. Now, usually, you especially do not want the advantage or the bonus that's tied to a sweeper to be tied to your own board presence. So here in the case of Sunfall, the fact that you're getting a creature that scales on your opponent's on how far your opponent was ahead, quote unquote, or how wide they went, is just an absurd idea. Like it is, that kind of upside should be tied to like an absurd cost in my opinion, because that is so punishing for the player who was set up to eat a Sunfall and then have to worry about like the crazy amount of board presence you're getting behind that. Fundamentally, conceptually, that is already flawed. Like no matter how you price the card, it would have to be like really, really priced highly for this to be something that's reasonable. And that's not even talking about the fact that, this is an exile-based sweeper. As I mentioned before, usually for cheaper sweepers, it's going to be destruction effects because those have a little bit more counterplay, and also, allow your opponents to play into like specific strategies that might need, a creature to die, go into the graveyard, where exile just completely shuts down everything that has to do with like nuance of like leaving or not leaving the battlefield, but like creatures going to the graveyard and stuff like that. That is just completely bypassed by exile, which is why it's such a strong mechanic. Like exile is dangerous as a mechanic because it has to be priced correctly as to not disrupt, some cards that are relying on, being destroyed or something, right? Like obviously there should be countermeasures to those cards that have a death proc, but you have to be careful, especially when you're tying it to a sweeper where everything leaves the battlefield. So that's already a premium there when we're talking about exile. And then when you take into account the incubator token scaling off your opponent's creatures, that's bonus on top of bonus. That has to have a price. Because from a theoretical standpoint, that is already a card that is very dangerous and that you have to make sure isn't too good as to not see play in the main deck of like every white deck, because otherwise you're going to have a metagame that is just really restricted on which colors you can play. And that's part of the problem is counterplay. You have to be careful when you're designing spells that are so good that they'll push other they'll push archetypes into specific colors, because Magic the Gathering fundamentally is a deck building game, right? It's a game where you want people to experiment. You want people to be able to say, okay, I want to be in these colors and I want to be in these colors or this color, like being able to pick your colors. That's part of the magic, literally. And each color, if you're going to print a card like this, which you shouldn't, but if you are going to print a card like this, you would only do so if those colors have like good counterplay to it, right? Like not just blue, which is kind of the problem here, where to counter this card, it's counter magic or phase effects, phase out effects, which are, I think, only in blue. I think phase out is only in blue, and obviously counter magic is only in blue. So when you're building a deck that is creature based, you have to really think about going into blue, essentially. And I think that's kind of a problem. Like, let's imagine, Sunfall being more of a tech card, like a little bit less good, and people would play in the sideboard. That's a little bit less problematic because game one is not affected. In game one, we know in Magic, game one has a huge advantage because of the play draw, because the person who wins game one, if they lose game two, gets to be on the play game three. And specifically for an aggro deck or a deck that might want to go wide, that is a massive, like that is a really important thing. And being able to shut those decks down in the main deck where they don't have time to bring things in, I think is a little bit dangerous. I mean, I keep saying dangerous, but it really is. Like, you have to be very careful if you were to design a card like this to make sure it's not too good. All right, so let's talk about balance. Balance is going to be more of the specifics when it comes to Sunfall. So 5 mana. Now, as I mentioned before, Depopulate is a really good sweeper, really well designed sweeper, and that costs 4 mana. 4 mana, Destruction Sweeper with downside. Okay, and we have a 5 mana Exile Sweeper with huge upside. And even in the context of 4 mana Destroy All Creatures being like the standard price for Destroy All Creatures, Sunfall for 1 extra mana is just way better than that. It's crazy how much better Sunfall is in terms of value, in terms of efficiency, compared to just the baseline. And even if it had no upside, Exile All Creatures, 5 mana, it would still be a really good sweeper. That's the irony here, is that the card is so overtuned that even if you strip away like the bonus, which is ridiculous, it is still like a really solid sweeper, right? People would 100% play Exile All Creatures 5 mana. It would see play. So already you have a problem there where any type of bonus is going to be ridiculous on a 5 mana cost card. So it leads me to how would you potentially fix a card like Sunfall, right? Because it's obviously ridiculously overtuned. How would you potentially design this card to make sense? Even though it is flawed fundamentally, we can try to find some solutions. Solution number 1, obviously, is to up the mana cost. That's always the solution for most cards, but you have to be careful that the card doesn't like end up being irrelevant. But in this case, I would say Sunfall, 6 mana. It might actually be fine, honestly. The thing is, you have to test balance changes. It's just there's only so much you can do with theory. But I would theorize that at 6 mana, this card would actually be fine. It would be costed in a way where most decks that are aiming to finish you off will end the game before that point, right? And that's important. Now, if that doesn't fix the problem, there are a few minute kind of differences that I would make to the card that I think would put it more in line with like more reasonable spell. So like the Incubator token not scaling off of the amount of creatures exiled and just being like a 2/2. That would be reasonable. Now that might be on top of the 6 mana cost. That might be like leave it at 5 mana, make it 2/2. That's still probably too strong. The other thing is, in general, I think the Incubator token should be only activatable sorcery. It's just too much power in the hands of the player who can activate or not activate on a whim, right? So they don't have to commit to anything, and that's kind of a problem. So sorcery speed. And then in general, as I said before, since Depop is in my opinion so well designed, if you're going to leave this card at 5 mana, I actually think the incubator token should go to your opponent, but it should probably be like a 1/1 or a 2/2, right? So what I'm saying is sweepers in general should probably have downsides if they're like really efficient. In Sunfall, exile all creatures. That's like pinnacle efficiency, right? That's the maximum efficiency of a sweeper. So you should probably give your opponent back some form of compensation, right? Like in general, I think that's like a good direction to go. If your sweeper is really effective, give your opponent something back, you know, and not in every situation, maybe, but like, you know, maybe if, okay, here's maybe, how about this? What if your opponent gets the incubator token only if you exiled 3 or more creatures or 4 more creatures, right? There's a lot of like specific clauses that you can add to a card to make the downside not as impactful when it shouldn't be, like Depop, right? And here, maybe if your opponent is like really far ahead on board, they get some compensation, right? And if you're just like 2 creatures, that's fine, right? There's nothing happens. It's just a sweeper, and I think that's totally reasonable when you have a card that's so ridiculous that maybe even with that downside would see play. I don't know. I would be more of like a card you would have to question though, and not just a play for in every white deck. That's kind of that's kind of the problem. I just don't like general design philosophy of like auto include sweeper. Like the card every time you're playing a deck that wants a sweeper, it's Sunfall or like what are you doing? Like what why would you not play Sunfall? That's the problem. When something's an auto include into an archetype and it's specifically something that affects the game as much as a sweeper does. Now, there's something I forgot to mention that I'm going to throw into this video because it's actually really important, and it's a huge point. Another point that makes Sunfall so good and unbalanced, in my opinion, and just poorly designed, is that it's a sweeper that you can play in a deck with creatures and not feel too bad about it. Usually, most sweepers will just, you know, annihilate your board and then whatever, like you just move on, right? It resets. But the fact that the Phyrexian token scales off of any creature getting exiled means that even your creatures getting exiled is still a minor benefit to you casting the spell, which means that the downside is lessened for you playing a sweeper in like a mid-range deck with like, you know, some tokens that you can play out, or I don't know, any creatures that you might want to play. Like you'll feel like, okay, well, at least, you know, I can sweep here and then I'll get like +1/+1 for free just because I have a creature on board. And that is like, that is really toxic design when it comes to a card that's supposed to be more specific in what it's supposed to accomplish. Like sweepers are supposed to reset your board, not like somehow give you even more board presence after casting it. It's just it's wild to me. But anyways, I'll leave you with that. Now to recap, Sunfall is overtuned, fundamentally flawed, and requires counterplay that is not easily accessible. All in all, it just seems like Wizards of the Coast sometimes, their design philosophy on certain cards is to make them the ultimate level of power creep as to what we've seen before. And that just seems to be tied to them wanting to sell more copies of the card or making it a format staple so people feel like they have to craft it if they want to play a certain archetype. And I just think that's a little bit sad for us as players and for the game as a whole. It's just unfortunate, but you know, it is what it is. But yeah, anyways, I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of everything wrong with Sunfall. If you want to vote on the card that I'm going to be covering next, go ahead and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you all in the next video.